This woman refused to stay safe inside the basket. Instead, she climbed on a rope at an altitude of 10,000 meters. Suddenly, her foot slipped and she nearly fell. But even then, she refused to give up. She glanced at her bloodied fingers, clenched her teeth, lunged upward, and climbed onto an even more dangerous rope ladder. The ladder swayed wildly, and she hung precariously. At this height, even the tiniest mistake could send her plummeting to a crushing death. After what felt like an eternity, she finally reached the edge of the hot air balloon. But the worst was yet to come. At this altitude, moisture in the air froze into frost, coating the balloon layer after layer. Even the ropes were frozen solid. Within moments, her hands were severely frostbitten. She could only use her wrists to pull herself up, climbing with great difficulty. She reached for the rope on her right, but it was just out of reach. Her hand slipped, and half her body dangled in midair, nearly falling to her death. Oxygen was thin at this height. Upside down, her vision began to blur. She was exhausted, but then she lifted her head and saw her companion inside the basket. Her mind instantly cleared. It wasn't time to give up yet. She steadied herself, struggled to grip the rope, endured the searing pain in her fingertips, and pulled herself back up hand over hand. Afraid of falling again, she tied the rope around her waist and tightened it with her teeth. Then, braving temperatures of -50°C, she kept climbing without hesitation at 10,000 meters high. The view was breathtaking. The massive hot air balloon now looked like a tiny, fragile bubble, ready to burst at any moment. The scene was stunning, but she dared not glance at it. The balloon was still rising. If she didn't open the valve soon, she and her companion would keep ascending into the sky. After climbing endlessly, she finally reached the top of the balloon. Frost covered her hair and face, stinging her skin. But with her life on the line, there was no time to spare. She rushed to the valve and tried to open it with her hands, but it wouldn't budge. She forced herself not to look down, then slowly stood up, shakily balancing herself. On the slippery top of the balloon, even the slightest wind would blow her off to her death. Gathering all her courage, she kicked the valve as hard as she could. Suddenly, hot air burst out, nearly knocking her over. The valve opened a crack. She jammed her foot in to hold it open, then crouched down, pulled out a dagger, and cut the shoelace. As soon as she finished, she could no longer hold on. Lack of oxygen, extreme cold, and hours of climbing completely clouded her mind. Finally, her body went limp, and she passed out in her unconscious state. A faint smile rested on her lips. But this was 10,000 meters above the ground. As the balloon swayed gently, her body began to slip. When she woke up some time later, the sight before her nearly made her faint again. She grabbed the rope in a panic, gasping for breath. Beneath her was an endless sea of clouds. The ropes were icing over, growing more slippery by the second. No matter how hard she tried, her body kept sliding down. She called out for help, but her companion huddled inside the basket, completely still. The woman despaired. She wrapped her legs around the rope to stop her fall, then began swinging her legs wildly, dangling in midair. The rope let out a horrifying creak. She took a deep breath, kicked off the basket, and swung backward as far as she could. Using the momentum, she finally reached the edge of the basket. But she was still not safe. The effort had drained all her energy. In the open sky, climbing into the basket alone was nearly impossible. She struggled, hooking her arms tightly around the rope. Her companion huddled motionless in the corner, his condition unknown. So she took one final gamble. With all her might, she threw herself into the basket. She had survived. There was no time for joy. She immediately crawled to her companion, calling his name. But his eyes were closed, and he didn't respond. Just as she thought he had died from lack of oxygen, his body suddenly trembled, and he drowsily opened his eyes. Tears of relief poured down her face. She excitedly explained that the altitude must have dropped, bringing more oxygen, allowing him to miraculously come back to life. As soon as he woke up, he immediately checked the meteorological equipment. Seeing that he was okay, she finally relaxed, collapsing limply into the basket, her hands throbbing in agony. He quickly grabbed a bottle of alcohol, bit off the cap, and poured it over her wounds to disinfect them. The alcohol burned fiercely, making her gasp in pain. But inside, she was overjoyed, because no one had ever flown this high before. Now the vent was open. They only had to wait for the altitude to drop, and they would return safely with precious meteorological data. But just as she thought they were finally safe, another disaster struck.